Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second last coffee chat of the year. Wow, it's been a long and tumultuous ride, but we made it to the end. And this is the part we are honestly saying goodbye to 2023 and getting ready for 2024. I know I always make this joke that I am always saying we're winding down, we're winding down. We officially are. We are officially winding down as the SAPIN crew, which stands for the SA Property Investors Network. And if you're watching us for the first time, hello and thank you. And if you are a regular, welcome and thank you for always being loyal to Coffee Chat brought to you by SAPIN. If this is your first time, who are we? Well, we're simple. We are a network of like-minded individuals that will either help you grow or start your property journey. It really is that simple. We have a phenomenal gentleman. Quite a few of you might know him, Ross Fitzcharles, and we are going to be discussing your rights as a landlord. Yes, to all of my investors, both inspired and current, we're going to be discussing what your rights are as a landlord in order to just help streamline the journey. And that's what we do here on Coffee Chat. But as always, we're going to be doing a quick roundabout of our events. And as I said earlier on, I have always been saying, oh, we're winding down. And then we have like 18 events. But no, right now we're doing the last ones of the actual calendar month. So we're going to be in Port Elizabeth on Wednesday, the 6th of September. We're doing our road show just to say thank you to all of our members across the country because we hit every single place. So Port Elizabeth on the 6th of September. The link will be in the chat box. And also we're going to be doing East London for the very first time. I cannot wait to see you guys. I want to hear that the room was filled to all my East Londoners. That's happening on the 7th of December. So as always, please register and that link will be in the chat box. And then lastly, on the 7th of December, it is our final and farewell, which is the youth event. That is also happening at our head offices in Edenvale at 6:30. And as always, Investor of the Year Award, please start putting in your entries. It's going to be big. It's going to be better. It's going to be massive. So as I said earlier on, is that we are actually having a very interesting conversation that oftentimes we don't talk about like how many rights do you have as a landlord? And I know that we don't particularly discuss that, but we're going to be talking about that today. So just let me know in the chat box where you are viewing us from and just say hello and thank you. But we're going to get it started right through. Can you please also help me welcome Ross? How are you, sir?
Hey, Khali. Nice to be on the coffee chat, and thanks for inviting me. Always fun being part of this session.
Yes, and as the elite property management company from preferental, you cannot use anybody else. It has to be preferential or nothing. That's just my biased opinion. But you deal a lot with landlords, correct?
Yeah.
So now we're going to be talking about what their rights are. Because we feel, for the most part, we understand from tenants, you're not allowed to have your electricity switched off, for example. We understand the rights of the tenant, but we haven't honestly discussed the rights of the landlord so much. And what I'm going to be doing is that, guys, please put your questions in the chat box as always, and I'll make sure that Ross gets those answered for you from preferential. So out the gate, as we always have these questions that are asked pre-hand, and this is something I've also wanted to know, is that when it comes to leasing, do you have the right to choose your tenant, or can you just accept anyone? Or you have to accept anyone?
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, we have to understand that as landlords, we can't discriminate against individuals who we want to place within our properties, but we also have the right to choose who we want there, and those rights need to be objective. So as a landlord, you need to understand the financial risk that this tenant is posing, how their credit or their background is in terms of making rental payments. And I think with the information like affordability, can they afford the property? Have they ever had any damages to previous properties that they occupied? And this type of information is from TPN. So as a landlord, we can definitely select who we want to live in the property, but it needs to be objective. And I think when landlords are doing their property viewings, we also sort of want to identify with a person that has that can build a good relationship with yourself. Because at the end of the day, managing your properties and managing your business, in effect, if you've got a portfolio, it comes down to relationships. And as a landlord, you've got the right to select the tenant that you feel you would ultimately have a better relationship with. But again, it needs to be objective, and we should not discriminate as landlords.
That is fantastic. It's good that you mentioned that it has to be from an objective perspective. So naturally, somebody with bad credit who has a history of non-payment, it would not be somebody anyone would want to, be their tenant. But as we're questioning that, is that this one, I think all of us, viewers, myself included, is that I get it, but I also don't get it. It's like, why are landlords allowed to ask for a deposit?
Look, landlords are allowed to ask for a deposit because they need to be protected in the way that the tenant is rented. So if a tenant defaults and you don't have a deposit in place, and you won't be able to, you can go down the legal route of trying to recoup the deposit of the outstanding rentals, but the deposit is there to protect you as a landlord. So that could cover from rentals, property damages, utilities owed from the tenant. And it's important to have the deposit. We're seeing with the current economy that landlords are actually upping their deposits. So yes, it's placing undue sort of stress on the tenant in terms of coming up with those double deposits, because that's quite what we're seeing in the industry. And with the economy, that it justifies it on the landlord side. And I think for the tenants, it is a bit of a pressure cooker when it comes to 10,000 rand rental. Now suddenly you need to pay 20,000 deposit plus a 10,000 rand rental. But definitely as a landlord, you have to ask a deposit. We're also seeing very interesting things in the market where landlords are charging a deposit, but they're saying your first month's rental is for free. The intention there is to place tenants and compete with these large corporates, because a lot of them, especially the guys at House, they're doing that. We've seen some of their ads come through. Landlords, and again, this is coming from the COVID time, so landlords have been trying to be creative in terms of placing those tenants. But I also want to sort of warn on that, or give a warning that it is risky if you are saying to a tenant, if you typically the last check you do once you've done your credit checks, your lease agreement, your viewings with your tenants, tenant can afford it based on the screening, they've never defaulted. The very last sort of check is whether this person can actually afford the deposit and a rental. And if landlords are being creative with that, it does place uncertain risk on the landlord, where the tenant now moves in with a single payment, and then they could potentially default from month 2, and then you basically have lost your first month's rental income, which your deposit can be used for. Now, with the very first default of the tenant, you're effectively out of pocket with 2 months, and you only have one deposit to cover for that. So yeah, landlords need to ensure that they do ask the deposits. I know it's tough in the economy, but if you're very diligent in your managing your portfolio, you need to ensure that you get the right tenant that can actually afford your property.
And I understand that, interesting that you say that in terms of, protecting yourself as a landlord. You guys offer a phenomenal product, of insuring your tenants, and that, rental can be covered if a tenant defaults. You can still recoup the rent up until a certain month while you guys do the eviction process. Can you just quickly tell us about that? Because I think it's pretty awesome from preferental.
No, Khali, I think the intention behind where the business was born was to help landlords manage their risk within a portfolio. And that part of that is not just having the right tools and systems, but also taking away the financial stress. So our premium products basically covers landlords for up to 4 months of default from the tenant. So effectively, your 1 month deposit becomes equivalent to 4 months. And then you also have damage cover that we provide landlords to the equivalent of 1 month's rentals. Now your 1 month deposit becomes 5. And then we also guarantee the eviction cost, and we pay for that. So we run through the entire eviction with the tenant. Again, it keeps it objective. So if a tenant's not paying their rent, there's no emotional decision tied to that. There's a process that follows, and we've got Expello who's doing our evictions for us. And it's a straightforward process. So as a landlord, you're protected from 1 month deposit gives you 5 months of cover, technically damages and rent. And then also we cover that unforeseen expense with eviction. And eviction typically starts with 20,000. So if your rental is 10, that gives you 7 months of cover for a single month of deposit. But again, I need to say that we also do the credit checks on that. And sometimes with high risk tenants, we do up the deposit to 2 months requirement for the tenant. So thanks for asking the question.
And interesting enough, when you're speaking about evictions, because evictions are such a uncomfortable thing, because there's a little running joke that says the best evictions is no eviction, right? So, but in the in the aspect of actually having to do an eviction, I think there's a question here that says, what are the terms needed to evict a tenant? Can you just throw them out, or is there a process? And also, what is the process? Because sometimes maybe that month I might have been late on rent. Doesn't mean I am officially about to start defaulting. I could have just had a rough patch. So how do we determine what the terms are for an eviction?
Yeah, I think you've got a solid point there. Tenants do find difficult months. And just going back to the previous question where I mentioned about preferental, I think the nice thing there is, as a landlord, you want to sort of manage your relationship with a tenant. And with preferental, if a tenant defaults, we typically go into a payment arrangement with that tenant for that month, but we still place them on terms. And I think that's important. So as a landlord, you need to follow the due course with when a tenant is actually in default, and your lease agreement clearly talks to that. So it's either there's excessive damages, there's illegal activities happening in the property, or they're defaulting on rental, or there's complex rules that the tenants are not adhering to, and that's placing penalty fees that the landlords are being charged, which you can uncharge to the tenant. But it's not nice being that landlord with that difficult tenant in a complex. So as a landlord, you need to know that you have to place the tenant on terms. So typically the lease agreement and the Consumer Protection Act says 20 business days is needed for terms. So if your tenant defaults on the payment of the first, as a landlord, you need to give the tenant 20 business days, not days, business days. So that effectively means almost a calendar month. And if the tenant pays the rent at the last day of the month, because they had potentially had a difficult month, then they basically settle that breach. And then as a landlord, you're going to the second month, and you could find yourself in this vicious loop where you're continuously placing the tenant on terms. But if the tenant has been placed on terms for any of those reasons inside of the lease agreement that you've clearly stipulated, and the typical lease agreement, like you can find from our lease agreement or the TPN lease agreement, indicates what is terms for a just cause. And so you will initiate a notice or a letter of demand. So there's two parts. So a letter of demand would be, I haven't paid my rent utility. There's a letter of demand being sent out either on the 2nd or between the 2nd and the 5th of the month. And then the tenant has 20 business days to rectify that. If after the 20 days they haven't rectified that, you can go to the court to cancel the lease agreement, and then you get a court, what is it called, a court order to basically tell the tenant to evict or vacate the property. Again, you can't then with that go and kick the tenant out. You need a sheriff to go out. So all of these do add up in costs. So that's of defaulting on your rental payments. And then on noise in the complex, continuously making noise. As a landlord, you can place the tenant on terms for that breach. And they've got 20 business days to rectify that breach. So if a tenant typically has noise in the complex or there's illegal activity going on, then they've got 20 business days to either stop whatever they're doing and not do that again, or the lease can be cancelled. I think the risk for the landlord is then you effectively telling the tenant that if you don't stop this, I will cancel the lease, and the legal implication of them then paying the rent is a different conversation. But as a landlord, you're telling them either fix this breach or move out. And if they opt to move out, then you potentially sit without a tenant for the next month.
And it's interesting when you're saying like these are the terms that pertain to you having the right to evict a tenant, because there is a question, but I think you literally just covered it. This is another one that I've always wanted to know in terms of, like, can the landlord require the tenant to fix any damages caused by the tenant? So it's always been like an interesting one in terms of what are the things that I as a tenant should pay for and what are the things that the landlord should pay for. Like, where do we have that separation that as a landlord, no, you're going to pay for this as the tenant, or is it, the other side where I'm like, no, this is actually a you problem?
Yeah, I think there's so much gray area in the law in terms of what sort of counts as a cost for the tenant or a cost for the landlord on maintenance. But I think the rule of thumb is your fair wear and tear. So if you've got carpets in your house and it's something that you expected, people will walk on the carpets and there's going to be some wear and tear. So if there's typical wear and tear, that cost will fall on the landlord. But if there's pets living in the house and the carpet's a mess and you have to clean or replace the carpet, then that is something the landlords can claim towards the tenants. And that falls on the tenant's responsibility. But within saying that, you as a landlord can't just go and say, okay, I paid 10,000 to replace this carpet 3 or 4 years ago. Let's say 5 years ago, I replaced the carpets, cost me 10 grand. And now I'm going to have to replace it and it's costing me 17,000. So here you go, tenant, here's your bill. You would have to then also take into consideration the lifetime of that carpet. So if the carpet had a lifetime of 10 years, you can actually just charge the tenant 5 years of the remaining years of replacing that at the new cost. So there's a lot of these type of rules, but as a landlord, you have the right to go to your tenant and say, unfortunately, this is your cost. Your lease agreement clearly indicates what responsibilities the tenants will have. So some landlords might have in the leases that if the tenant moves out and a light bulb has gone out, then that is for the tenant. And again, the lease agreement is there seen as, let's call it a divorce paper. So upfront, you decide who's responsible for what at the point of the tenant moving out. And as a landlord, you can then always fall back to say to the tenant that, look, the globes, I've had to replace 20 globes in the property. Here's the charges, and this is on you, because you can fall back to the lease agreement. And I just want to say again, so the rule of thumb is the fair wear and tear. If there's hinges, cupboard hinges, and that comes loose or breaks, then if someone can't prove that it's been excessive abuse of the cupboard, like slamming the cupboard doors and like pulling it open, but the expectation is that small things like that's got an expected lifetime on them typically falls on the landlord to fix that.
Okay. And interesting when you're saying that, we were talking about, deposits and stuff. I have a question now from Samkelo Nglovu. He wants to know, my tenant vacated the unit 2 days before rent being due. What can I do, and does preferental cover it?
So let's start.
Like, well, I'm moving out, but then doesn't pay the rent for that month. What do we do as a landlord?
Yeah, I think that's something that's a risk that all landlords are exposed to. Tenants just vacating, let's call it abscondment. So they don't give any notice, or they give like super short notice saying like, thank you, but I'm leaving in the next 2 days. As a landlord, that it depends on your lease term. So if the tenant has moved out somewhere in the lease term and suddenly just decides that they're vacating, then the landlord has the right, according to the lease agreement, to hold the tenant liable for up to, again, depending on the lease agreement, but up to 2 months of rental that the tenant needs to pay. And they can actually claim that from the tenant. But if you place someone, so let's say the 2nd or 28th of November, they said they're vacating the property, and you have not placed someone for the 1st of December, then you can charge them for the month of December that they will be liable to pay for. I mean, that's too, like, you can't expect a landlord to find a tenant in 2 days. But the landlord can then also charge the January rental to that tenant should they not place someone by the 1st of Jan. But again, going back, if the tenant goes to the tribunal and they dispute this, the landlord must be in a position to prove that they have advertised their property and they've actively tried to find a tenant. They've showed the property to potential tenants, and that would sort of protect the landlord to hold the tenant liable for those full 2 months. And if the tenant vacates the property within the lease term, the landlord can claim the new placement of the agent to the tenant. But if the tenant lived in the property for 10 months, the expectation would have been after 12 months, the tenant could say, I'm vacating the property. And the landlord would in any case place a tenant through, let's say, an agent or themselves. So let's say an agent. The agent will charge him 1 month's rental. The landlord would in any case have paid that. So what the law is saying, if there's 10 months utilized, then the remaining 2 months, so you'll take the agent fee divided by 12, multiplied by 2, and that's the amount that you can actually charge to a new tenant. So if it was my tenant, 2 days notice, I would basically write back to the tenant to say, unfortunately, according to this clause, and you should find it in your lease agreement, there should be an early cancellation fee that you can charge. And that fee has got a rand amount linked to that. And because of the early cancellation, they will be liable for the rental of December. Another thing to look out for is in your lease agreement, the tenant, you as a landlord typically have a clause, if you've put that in, where the tenant can give you either 30 days notice, or the CPA actually talks about 20 business days that the tenant can give you notice and they can vacate the property. So in this case, even according to the CPA, the tenant is not given enough time to vacate the property. And then the landlord can hold the deposit and deduct the rental of December from that deposit that they've taken from the tenant. And if there's not a deposit, then the landlord can invoice the tenant for the month of rental. But again, we find that collecting that is quite time consuming, difficult, and could ultimately cost you legal fees that you would have to sort of take into account. Is it worth paying the legal fees to get the rental back from the tenant?
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Ross. As we round up, I just want to know, like, do you have any, parting words for our future landlords in terms of, how do they protect themselves and the steps that they can take, and, the rights that they're having?
Okay. Sorry, I just realized that I missed the second part. Does preferental cover it? So preferental has got a built-in, with what we provide landlords is that 4 months rental guarantee. But if there's a short notice given to landlords, we do provide an abscondment cover. So that's where if the tenant, after the 6th of the month, give you notice that they're vacating, then preferental will basically pay the landlord. So in this example, preferental would have covered the landlord for December, and then hopefully giving that landlord some breathing space to find a tenant to place on the 1st of January. So yeah, parting words, I would say, guys, it was a tough year. We've experienced a lot of interest rates increases during this year, and it's had a massive impact on all of our portfolios. So I would say that enjoy December. I'm looking forward to the break. I mentioned to Khali just before the call, I think it was one of those tough years. I'm definitely going to enjoy that, and let's spend some time in December just thinking through what our strategy is for the 2024 year. If it's around managing the risk within your portfolio, more than happy to reach out to our team and just understand our product and how we can help landlords. And if it's around expanding your portfolio and make sure that you've got the right power team behind you in terms of cost savings. We've recently bought another property ourselves, and it's just these. I always say the worst thing for asking for a discount or asking for some form of lenience is the worst thing that can happen is they can say no. So go out there, be bold, ask for these discounts, ask for the specific support, and enjoy the December break.
Awesome. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Ross from Preferental, the best management agency in my humble biased opinion. But we have... Oh, okay. Leonard, you can get into contact with Ross at SAPIN Connect. So we'll put the link in the chat box, and you can literally contact Preferental that way. So we'll have that in there for you. But yes, Ross, people are seeing the value in Preferental. And like I said, thank you so much. And as we wind down, just want to have a quick recap of the events that we're going to be having. So to all my people in PE, we're going to be having an event on Wednesday the 6th in Port Elizabeth at 6:30. Links will be in the chat box. And lastly, we're going to be having another event in East London for the first time, and that's going to be on the 7th. And that's also at 6:30. And lastly, we have the youth event on the 7th of December at 6:30 at our head offices in Edenvale. From me to you and Ross, I want to say thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. And as always, I will see you next week.